Okay, well, so those who are watching will realise that actually neither Sima and I have moved or changed. So we're actually running in the next podcast now, but it's a separate episode. So, and we're continuing on the direwolves. We're going to get a different view, and again, this is someone I work with. It's a chap called Pete Hudson. So without any further ado, I suggest we get him on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so my name's Peter Hudson. I'm an ecologist, and I work particularly on wildlife diseases and how the wildlife diseases get from one species to another, including ourselves. And I'm based here at Penn State University in America, and I've been here for about 20 years.
And just as a heads up, Sima, you already know this, but our listeners don't. Pete and I have worked together for some time on the wolves in Yellowstone, and we've discussed this a lot.
Okay, great. So I guess in that case, this is your area of expertise. You might have to forgive the odd naive question from me, both of you.
These naive questions are the best.
Yeah. So what you might not know, Sima, is wolves used to roam Yellowstone, for thousands of years. And then in the 1920s, they were deliberately driven extinct by the National Park Service.
Oh, really?
And mountain lions were shot as well, and bears were shot. And then the mountain lions came back naturally, the bears came back naturally, but the wolves were reintroduced in the 1990s, and that's sort of been a story of a success story of sort of rewilding almost. So that's what's been going on, and Pete can tell us a little bit more about it and the effect that we think the wolves have had.
Oh, wonderful.
So my interest in this was really because I'm interested in how diseases invade naive populations, the emergence of new diseases. And so I was looking for some places where people were reintroducing naive animals without diseases, and then I could see how the new diseases invaded. And the Yellowstone wolves were a classic example because they released 35 individuals, and they were all cleared of parasites. They'd all been vaccinated. They were all squeaky clean. And then our good friend Doug Smith released them into Yellowstone and recorded what happened. And he kept really detailed data on what happened to the packs, how they developed, and he also took blood sera samples and followed their genetics. And that's how Tim and I got involved, because Tim's interested in pedigrees, I'm interested in disease. So the population of wolves expanded very rapidly. It came to something like 164 individuals. And at the same time, the elk population fell and a number of other things took place. As the wolf population increased, so mange moved in.
So mange is, just for our listeners, mange is caused by a little mite, isn't it?
That's right. It's a tiny mite that gets into the wolves and it causes them to lose their hair. And you do not want to be hairless if you're living in Yellowstone when it's minus 30, minus 40. And it doesn't matter if it's centigrade or Fahrenheit because it's very, very cold. And so I thought the mange could be disrupting the social structure of the wolves and may have caused some of the bigger wolf packs to disintegrate. It was certainly associated with it, but an interesting thing we found was that the wolves form a sort of health system where they care for the wolves that are, I think it was the first time it's ever been recorded. The wolves care for the sick wolves and they go off and do the feeding. And my graduate student, Emily Armberg, followed some of these sick wolves and found they were going to the hot springs to keep warm. It was really cool.
So Yellowstone's got all these hot, crazy geothermal springs. I don't know if you've been, but you have to come one day.
So to compensate for the
loss,
hair loss,
yeah.
go to the spring. Wonderful.
Exactly. And then we started looking at canine distemper virus there. And I remember Tim and I having long discussions about what was taking place. Tim was interested in the fact that the proportion of black wolves was increasing. And I was interested in the fact that there were these occasional outbreaks of canine distemper, which was stopping all the babies being produced. Anyway, the long story is that we demonstrated that there is a gene that originally came from domestic dogs and introgressed into the wolf population, and it gives them a selective advantage through their immune system in defending them against canine distemper. So there was selection for wolves to become black. And There are complications in there because when you have a homozygote, when you have a wolf with double black genes, it dies. The grey wolves are not resistant against canine distemper, but if you've got a mixture and you've got a heterozygote, then those wolves do well. And when Tim pointed that out, I go, oh, it must be disease and it must be canine distemper. So we took a long time, because we had to see regular outbreaks of disease, to demonstrate that, in fact, there was selection for black wolves against canine distemper. And that was fascinating to me from the disease side, and fascinating to Tim from the wolf pedigree.
So the black heterozygotes survived better in years when there was canine distemper virus. And canine distemper virus is like measles for dogs.
Correct.
And wolves, yeah.
And it's a pulmonary infection. So it's like measles. It isn't the spots you should worry about. It's the fact that it's in your lungs you should worry about.
So this is the same mutation that Bridget talked about in part 1 of this.
That's right. So she mentioned that about that causing wolves to be black, and then what Pete's about to tell us is what you should do. What the optimal thing to do is if you're a grey wolf or a black wolf.
That was a leading.
He's bad.
It all depends on the frequency of the outbreaks. So if you get a frequency of outbreaks like once every 5 years, then you're better off being black. But you need grey wolves there to breed with.
Yes.
But if it's less frequent than that, then you might as well get through those bad years, and so the advantages get all the time, depending on the frequency. And my student did this wonderful study where she went right across America and showed that places where canine distemper was rare, the wolves were grey, and when the canine distemper was more common, there was selection for black. So not only did we show this over time in Yellowstone, but we showed it across space as well. Now, the next question that Tim and I got really involved in is, what are the consequences of introducing wolves into Yellowstone? And there's been a YouTube that was put out a very long time ago, 2018? No, it can't have been. Let's say 10 years.
I think. Yeah, about 10 years, 2015.
About 10 or more years ago, which said that wolves were having a trophic cascade, which means the wolves come in, the elk go down, the grass and browsing is reduced, so the trees come back and the beavers come back, and that's called a trophic cascade, when it's sort of plus minus all down through the ecosystem. There are some things that they claimed are unlikely to happen. In other words, it's making up stories. So Tim and I have been looking at this in much more detail, and Tim has a couple of fantastic postdocs examining the data and running models on this. And yes, wolves do have an effect. They do influence the elk population, but mountain lions have a similar effect. At the same time, grizzly bears have come back, but there are other factors taking place. So it's more complicated than was thought. And as Tim always says, we need more science to understand it. And in all honesty, if we don't understand the ecology of Yellowstone, what the hell chance does America have in understanding the ecology of any system, let alone one with dire wolves in it?
And you mean that last statement you made is because it's such a great example of where things were forcibly removed, and then some came back naturally, some came back, some were reintroduced. So it gives you a nice sort of, not closed system, because nothing in a way is a closed system, but it gives you a nice sort of small system in this to sort of examine lots of different variables. Is that what you mean?
Yes, I do, but it's also what we would consider the pristine habitat for the Rockies and Central America. Are these prairies, which would have had this natural system there. So, and of course that's changed hugely. I mean, the whole of the East Coast has changed, the Midwest has changed, but the Yellowstone represents is a almost pristine ecosystem. And while it's only 2 million acres, it sits in an area of the greater Yellowstone, area, which is 22 million acres. So it's the most natural part we have really left in the United States end of North America. I mean, if we go into Canada, and there's vast areas of natural, but not in the United States. So I think ecologically, it's very important. It's like going to Africa, you have to study the Serengeti, because that is the natural ecosystem. And then you can see how that varies all the way down through South Africa and things. And we can compare Yellowstone with Kruger, for example. But we've got to understand Yellowstone and the role of wolves. So that's important.
And so it's also a place that's been studied in a lot of detail. So there are people studying the elk, there's people studying bison, people studying bears. There's a lot of really good science going on, and we can pull those information together. And you don't get that anywhere else, really, in that level of detail. Certainly not on a big scale.
Sure.
One of the problems we have is working in a national park is we can't do the experiments we would like to do.
Yeah.
So we have to do the monitoring and the modelling to do it. I'm very much on the experimental side. Tim's very much on the modelling side. So if I have my way, I'd remove wolves again tomorrow, or remove them in some areas, not other areas. And that's what I would like to do in the ecosystem. Ethically wrong to do, and of course we can't do it. So I have to work with Tim because he does all the clever modelling.
So Pete, did dire wolves die from canine distemper virus?
Most unlikely. I mean, they died, 13,000 years ago at the end of the Pleistocene, when there was the mass extinction of the Pleistocene big mammals. They had evolved to be very big, and they'd been evolved to bring down big bisons, sloths, and all those remarkable and huge animals that used to live in North America at that time. So, and they just probably died off because they lost their prey. But that was at the same time that Clovis man was coming in, and they developed those spears. And so there's an interaction with humans improving their technology to kill off these big mammals. And so there's a big debate all the time whether it was climate or humans, but it was probably an interaction between the two.
But now they're back, right? The dire wolf is back.
No, it's not. This is not a dire wolf at all. This is what they've done is they've basically taken a wolf genome, done a little bit of editing to make them look like dire wolves. And one of our colleagues wrote recently, it's like taking a short Frenchman, putting Napoleon's hat on his head and saying, that is Napoleon. That is clearly not Napoleon. Another way of thinking about it is to take a chimpanzee, do a little bit of editing on their genes to make their hair and skin look a little bit different, saying, look, humans, we've just done genetic engineering, produced. It's not. It's still a chimpanzee,
But it's what they've done is quite clever. And, Bridget von Holt made a good defense of this, is they have been able to take some genetic variation that was lost, a genetic variant that had been lost, that was extinct, and they've been able to bring that genetic variant back to life in a grey wolf.
Yes, but it's still a grey wolf at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But so, I do agree with you that the technology is very clever. And an important question we should ask is there a role for this sort of technology in conservation? And what I love about what Colossal are doing is they're thinking outside the box, well outside the box, and they're thinking about the ways they can do this. But, and this is the big but as far as I'm concerned, most of the conservation issues we're talking about, in fact, if you look at the 10, 12 most recent extinct species, they've all gone extinct because of habitat loss. And so this is not really addressing the habitat loss issue. This is tweaking on the side compared to the massive problems we're actually looking at. And, if you had millions and millions of dollars and you ask me what should we do with it in terms of conservation, I would not say we should do this. So it is in many ways, it's a publicity stunt, and it's a good publicity stunt, but it's not. I mean, do we really want dire wolves back? Well, since we haven't got giant buffalo or giant sloths or the ecosystem at the late Pleistocene, what are you going to do with them? And
But I
sticking
guess
them on a 2,000-acre ranch is not the answer.
But I guess this is a stepping stone to doing what needs to be done. Is that right?
No, not necessarily what needs to be done. So it depends what question you want to ask. De-extinction, I think, is a fallacy, really. It's just a play on words. But what they could do is they could help us with the diversity of some species that are in a genetic bottleneck. So, for example, the red wolf, and they're doing beautiful work on this. Give Colossal all the support they want for doing this. The red wolf, what are we down to? 20 individuals, and they've lost a lot of their biological diversity. And so they're sort of using coyote genes and things to help increase that diversity. And that's what we need to try and get them back. And I think we've got the habitat good enough for it to come back. But almost every other species is lost because we've destroyed its habitat. And tweaking with its genes is not going to put habitat back, I'm afraid.
So what would you do then, Pete? How are you going to save the world?
So I'm quite an optimist, actually. I think there's a lot of species that can coexist with us. And I think if we don't persecute them, and, it's lovely I'm stunned how leopards can live in the back streets of Mumbai, for example.
Yes.
I think there's a lot that can be done through rewilding. And look what Charlie Burrell has done in the southern parts of in England.
This is NEP you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, this is NEP, where what he's done is he's rewilded the area. And he said, well, we don't have some of these ancient species. So let's use agricultural animals who had the same functional response and put them back. So he put them back, and he's had an incredible impact on biodiversity. And he hasn't had to go through all the bioethical issues and problems that they're doing with the genes. So, rewilding, I think, could be done certainly without bringing the direwolf. Let's face it, that must be a publicity stunt. They should really, and if they said, oh, well, we want to do this genetically, what should we do? And I should get on with cloning. Just do straight cloning like we did with Dolly the sheep 30 years ago. You could clone a whole pile of red wolves and interbreed them and release them, for example. And that would be a good thing to do. If they say, well, what species should we de-extinct? I think I would choose the Pyrenean ibex, which has habitat and it's a subspecies. So it'd be easy to bring it back with the other ibex species. And then you could just do some genetic manipulations and release them into the Pyrenees.
So you don't think there's any hope to bring back, say, lost ecological function? This is something that we talked about a little bit, and some of the lost ecological function that's happened reasonably recently is outside of Africa, the loss of the big animals, the giant sloths you talked about, the mammoths and what have you. You don't think there's any point in trying to bring those back, say, recreate a mammoth? We can get lots of DNA out of mammoths on the Siberian steppe that, occasionally defrost and a wolf will eat them. Wouldn't it be possible to bring those back? And then we've got some ecological function that has been lost.
Well, of course, de-extincting the mammoth is a really complex thing, unless you're going to do what they're trying to do, which is take an Asian elephant and make it have a woolly coat so it can live in, but it's still not a mammoth. And they have these rather facile discussions about the species concept. I mean, the species concept is not, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it is a duck. There's much more to a duck than just a quack and looking like a duck. It has to do more than that. So that's what my point was about what Charlie Burrell did with the NEP, that you can use other species or even domesticated animals, and we use them a lot in conservation as functional groups to do that. So if you put elephants with woolly coats back to try and reduce the impact of climate change, which I think Colossal is one of the things that they're advocating, basically what you're saying is let's put them back so they can graze the grass and knock down the trees. But you don't really need mammoths to do that. Right. So I think, if you think about it functionally, there might be incidents, and I'm not going to say never, but I think there are other ways we could do this. And I am absolutely shocked that the bioethics of this is not really being discussed in detail.
Yes.
I mean, would I be allowed in my university to produce a direwolf? Absolutely not. My bioethics people would be all over me within seconds. And then you say, well, how do you do the bioethics at Colossal? They asked George Church to do it. And George Church is the guy who's been advocating this. He set up the company, and talk about conflict of interest in their bioethics. I think that's absolutely iniquitous, and they should not be allowed to get away with that sort of thing. It's really not acceptable in the scientific world, where you're giving yourself permission to actually do it. And recently there was the whole case of He Jiankui, the guy in China who did the genetic modifications in the human babies.
Oh, yeah.
Protection against HIV. Well, if you watch some of the videos and films about that, it's clear that George Church was sort of encouraging him, and he was encouraged by people in the CRISPR world, to actually go out there and push the envelope. And even he is saying, well, I got thrown in prison for doing this, but in a few years we'll be doing this. And the bioethics slope into designer babies, horrific. I really worry about that. So there are some big bioethics issues, and I'm surprised that Colossal have been allowed to get away with this, really.
So Pete, oh, sorry, go on.
I was just going to so I'm also do computer modelling, although not at an ecological scale, on a molecular scale. And it's sort of, I guess, thinking about things from a modelling perspective, I was thinking that talking about sort of de-extinction or bringing back a species because they became extinct, say due to climate change or something like that, then when thinking about the species itself, should we not also, alongside that, think about the climate and everything else and what we're doing to combat climate change from a climate perspective? And so the two should go hand in hand. So in the sense that there's no point bringing back a species, if that makes sense, if
Yes.
the ecosystem or the climate is not ready for that, because it'll just become extinct again. So the sort of a cross sort of modelling, perhaps.
So I totally agree, and that is the basis of what I'm arguing. That I think that is, you can't do that. So there is no point bringing back an animal like a direwolf or a mammoth and introducing it into a habitat which doesn't exist anymore. What are you going to do with them? Well, you're going to end up keeping them in a zoo. And really, that's a huge waste of money. I'm also very worried that it's taking the focus away from the conservation things that we really should be focused on. Because, if you're going to try and conserve these species, then what we've got, and over the next 50 years, this is really important, you've got to get their habitat right. I do think that with improvements in agriculture, and you only have to look at what Holland has done with their agriculture, where they've intensified it. It's got a huge population in Holland, but by intensifying their agriculture, doing these very intriguing ways of agriculture, they can have much bigger areas of wilderness. And I think that's going to help us a lot to have big areas of wilderness, and that's what we need to be focused on. De-extinction, well, there could be a couple of species that are going to go extinct and have gone extinct that we would want to put back. And as Tim says, you might want something functionally. And I don't disagree with that. So I think developing this technology and then thinking outside the box is fantastic. That is really good. The direwolf must be a publicity stunt, though. And, focusing on the red wolf, what they're doing is superb. Great. Get on with it.
So kind of just looking at the time, we're sort of been chatting for a while. But what about the sort of approaches Colossal would use for improving plant breeding and plant productivity, for example.
That's interesting.
So I don't know whether there's sort of any kind of lost domesticated plants that you could bring back from, but genetic engineering plants, you're not going to have the bioethics issues at the same level. People aren't going to be worried about that. You improve crop yield, which takes pressure off land and perhaps freeing up some space for wildlife that's struggling at the moment.
Aren't we already doing that? Don't you think?
I think we are.
And I mean, everything from tomatoes through it is, and I was worried about it when it started and the GMOs, and but I think I've been proven wrong. I think they've doing a really good job, particularly if it's going to help us with wilderness areas and these areas where we might be growing crops in combination with having wild areas. So I can see us having rainforest and certain crops together and things like this. I think we've got to look at a way that we can all coexist.
Yeah, you could bring back the cucado, which is a cross between a cucumber and avocado that went I've made that up, actually. Making sandwiches easier. But no, I mean, yeah.
They bring the quoll back. What about bringing the quoll back in? Or helping
the hairy nose wombat or something like that. Yeah. The eastern quoll still survives, right? But there are some I think that have gone extinct, or the lesser bilby, things like that. Yeah.
Yes, things like that. But I just think you could do a lot of this with cloning. And I worry about their statements that they can solve all the conservation problems through this, through just using genetic engineering, but you have, as we just said, that you have nowhere to place them if you do that, and the conservation is important, is absolutely important.
But let's finish on a note of optimism, because I mean you've already said it's good technology. Completely agree with that, but there are parts of the world that are naturally rewilding. So. Well, Pete and I spent a bit of time in northern Italy with a student of ours a while ago. And it's quite remarkable what's happened there, Pete, isn't it? Where people have left the land.
It is, because they have abandoned the land in parts of Italy. And a consequence, the wolves have reinvaded. And I remember working in Italy 25 years ago, and they said, well, we were talking about brown bears, and they said, well, there's no point to doing brown bears. Well, you can see brown bears almost every day if you're up in Trentino. You only have to go into a bar in Trento, point the right way, look at the cliffs, get a telescope out, and you can see the bears on the cliffs opposite. That's rewilding, and it's just fantastic. And the fact that they're living close to humans is even better, I think.
Well, Pete, before you give too many other secrets away of our fieldwork techniques, it's probably time to say thank you so much for joining us. I mean, it's a really fascinating discussion, and it is interesting what Colossal Biosciences have done, and it's new territory, and there's certainly a lot of certainly a lot of disagreement out there, but it's great to hear your take on it, and as always I hugely respect it, so thank you for joining us.
So just one final comment just before we go is, I just looked it up. Colossal is worth more than 10 billion at the moment. Huge investment into it. So I just wonder if it's just a big financial bubble that will burst, but we'll see.
Time will tell.
On optimism.
Thanks so much, Pete. It's been
Pete.
Great for you joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed that.
Wow, that was really interesting, and it was, I guess, unsurprisingly, that similar examples were given and sort of the same concepts were touched on, but actually from very different viewpoints. Again, I found Bridget and Pete very convincing, and I have to say that I agreed with Pete's concerns about the sort of bioethical aspects or the lack of attention that's been given to those. What did you think, Tim?
I think it's a very difficult area. So actually, I think I agree with both of them, believe it or not. So I do think that Colossal Bioscience, the technology is impressive. It clearly has some uses, so I completely agree with that. I don't believe that the animal that they've created is a direwolf. It's a genetically modified grey wolf.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean it's not technologically advantageous. But there are some questions. And I think those questions are, I think there are some about the bioethics. Pete said it in his university, Penn State, he wouldn't be able to do it. It's the same in Oxford. If we wanted to do that, we would not get permission to do that. But it's the corporate world's different from the university world. I understand that as well. I do think I hope that people don't end up saying, well, we can just genetically engineer lost animals if they go extinct, so it doesn't matter if they go extinct, because I don't think we can do that yet. And I think that is a danger. But I think Peter's right. There could be a role there as well. So I'm kind of with. I think the answer is, as usual, it's incredibly nuanced, and I think to some extent it's up to our listeners. But I'd be really interested in what you take, Simon, because you're a scientist who's interested in this sort of thing, but it's not your day-to-day job area of expertise. And where do you sit, really? I think that's
I think the technology is enormously exciting. I can see many uses, but I guess I can see some concerns too. So as I mentioned to Pete, this idea that some functionality or something is brought back that has not, either we don't have the environment or the ecosystem for it, or it does something completely unexpected and has devastating consequences. And I think for me, and I sort of touched upon what I asked you earlier on about this idea of sort of modelling and trying to predict what happens, more cross-modelling, I think. So, your work on wolves, and then talking to the people who model elks and the people who model the flora, for example. That sort of, once we start integrating those models and things become, I think I might feel more confident then, if that makes sense.
Well, so we are building models of Yellowstone, which are really quite complicated. And I think one of the things that we discover, and it's probably very similar in your world, we can predict little bits of it reasonably well, but predicting the whole system is incredibly complicated.
Yes.
So we'd be a bit foolhardy if we could say we actually can predict with great accuracy what's going to happen in Yellowstone, even if we might be able to say, well, if you do this one thing, if you shoot a load of wolves, elk are going to go up. We might be able to say something along those lines.
Sure.
And it's probably the same in your world, where you're modelling the behaviour of how molecules interact. But if you try and model the whole cell, you're not there yet. It's too complicated. So same sort of problem, I think.
And I think for our listeners and viewers, it's important for us to stress that the issues with modelling any aspect of biology comes with just the multitude of scales we have to deal with. So both spatial and temporal. So the time scales and, in terms of the sort of spatial scales, going from tiny, if we're not even considering what's happening to the bacteria that lived on the skins of these animals, for example.
Exactly.
Right? So
exactly.
all of these things that that we have to consider that we're not even aware of many of these things.
Or the fungi that might turn them into zombies.
Zombie ants. Yes.
Anyway, I think we can. Well, they were both great guests, and I think they've really done a nice job in displaying the issues. And hopefully, people will write in with send in questions or write in with their views.
We'd love to hear people's views.
Fantastic. Well, we'll catch up next time.
Yep. Look forward to it.
Yeah.
See you, Tim.
Okay. Bye.